Good morning to each one of you, and thank you for coming today. As I mentioned in the little piece that I sent here, it all began in the Bronx. My mother used to tell me to go out and play. Now, the Bronx, when I was growing up, where we lived, was very safe. She could just say, go out and play. There were no play dates. There was no expectation that somebody was out there waiting for me. Just get out of the house, I think is really what she meant. Get out from under me. We lived in an apartment building. And so I would go out to play, and at times there would be nobody there. But it was when I first began to sense that there is a presence, is the best word I could use. Not someone, because someone ends up being in a box, and someone ends up being a noun. This was not a thing, or it was a presence. And I was a little boy then, but I knew that I wasn't alone. And at first, there was a sense of loneliness. There was nobody to play with. But it's not a kind of loneliness that makes you feel like you're a loser or something's the matter with you or so on and so forth. It was just the loneliness that I've since read about that one must have if one is going to become a contemplative. Because it's that loneliness, if you don't try to fill it, something good can happen. Too often in our culture we think we're lonely and we instantly try to fill it up with shopping, travel. Nowadays it'd be texting, getting on your computer, any number of things to not have the sense that I am by myself. But I just had that feeling. And I knew it wasn't the same as what I was being taught about in school. It wasn't God as it was being taught to me. See, when I went to Catholic school in the Bronx, and we received our first Holy Communion in the first or second grade very early on. And the idea was that God was someplace. God was a noun. And God was someplace. And if I went through the rituals, was baptized, and so I went through the rituals and had been good. So it's a negotiated relationship. If I had been good, then I get God in me. And then God and I can be together. But the idea that God loved me unconditionally or was always within me was not very clear, if at all explained. The church I grew up in was really not a very contemplative church. It was more the active church of the West, active Christianity. So this sense of this presence was not identified the same as what's in the host. It was not until later that I would be able to say, oh, it is the same, just a deeper, more real presentation, if you will, just it was a more intimate presentation. But one thing I like to do, especially during our Mass, was sit quietly after communion, because back then we didn't sing, the choir sang. So we didn't have to be bothered with these things, and we could just go sit down and shut up and kneel, which is what we're supposed to do. And I liked that quiet time. The other thing that I found I liked was, and I didn't think I was odd, I just felt an attraction. And I think this is important if you're going to be a contemplative, it's an attraction, a kind of urge or nudge, as we used to say in the Bronx, a little something, go do this. And that I had that to go sit in the summertime when we weren't in school, just to go sit in our church in the Bronx, St. Francis of Rome, in the middle of the morning. There'd be nobody there. Or maybe there was somebody lighting a candle, but it was basically quiet. And I just liked to sit. And although I knew that Jesus was in the tabernacle in the host, it wasn't as if I went to visit him there, like a lot of us Catholics do. We go someplace to talk to God. Never occurs to us that we don't have to go anywhere. So I just like to sit there and be still. And I didn't have any methods. I didn't have any vipassanas. I didn't have any training. There was nothing except just be here now. Now, I didn't use those words, but later when I read Ram Dass, be here. Just be you. Don't try to become anything else. And I think that is an important part of the contemplative tradition that I was to learn later. As long as you're trying to be somebody else, God doesn't know you. Because this presence is a creative presence that didn't make me to be somebody else. Made me to be Terry Ryan. And I have to find out who that is, which is not the same as self-realization movements. It's something about knowing that there's a deepness within you and allowing yourself to be taken there by inaction is, I think, something that I learned to be very important. So I would just like to sit there. And I found out as I was cleaning out my memorabilia earlier this year, I found an 8th grade, not a yearbook, but a little book in which us kids could write into each book something. And there were the 3 things you wanted to be. And I wrote down priest. And I didn't know that. I said, I wrote priest in the 8th grade? Well, there's girls, but a priest. So it could have been Episcopal, but in Catholic, just forget it. So then high school and college, I just sort of went through it, trying to fit in, trying to find myself from outsides. And then, of course, college, what do you want to be? What do you want to study? What do you want to do? And I was, and all those kinds of things. But one of the things that was very clear to me again was my first night at college. I went to Fordham College in the Bronx. But I was on campus. I was going to live on campus. The first night, it was evening, and the chapel was very close to our freshman dorm. And I went over to it, and it was open. And I sat there, just like I did as a little boy in the Bronx. And again, I had no agenda. It wasn't like God helped me to get through 4 years of this college and so on. It was just sit there and be. They locked me in. And what I remember that is it never occurred to the person in charge of the grounds that anybody would be in there, sitting there doing nothing. That should have told me that I was kind of an odd, not quite centered in the center of the way things were going to be. I had to climb through the window to get out. And I never went back there in the evening to sit quietly, just figuring they're not going to look for me. But I could have stayed there all night. Any case, those kinds of things were what struck me. I went to, after graduate school, I went to Chicago for my first job. Now, through high school, college, graduate school, those were just blur years in terms of a more contemplative life. It was very much living on the outsides, doing what people said you should do, getting an MBA because you get a better job. And so I went to Chicago, worked for a big oil company. But what struck me, and I remember asking some of the other workers there, what's the difference between buying our gasoline and somebody else's gasoline? Who cares? It's all gasoline. what is the meaning of our lives? Do you really find what you're doing to be important? And they did. They found that working for Standard Oil of Indiana, called American Oil, I guess, in the gas station, Standard Oil of Indiana, was fulfilling. And that should have told me something, that it wasn't fulfilling for me. It wasn't Terry Ryan, that I was living somebody else's life. But I didn't have the guts to do anything about it. But two things happened in those 2 years in Chicago. Two of the most miserable winters you could ever have, of course, but I didn't know that Chicago every year. What happened was I liked sitting in the cathedral church by myself, just like I did as a boy. And I would go there sometimes, very different from the sort of playboy life we were supposed to be living, single, you have extra money, blah, 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 living on the near north side. But I sometimes would just go and sit there quietly without any agenda or any meditation thing. And it was fulfilling. It was, again, I was in a presence. And the other thing was, I remember going to a bookstore. I think it was, if it wasn't a Catholic bookstore, it was kind of religious. It was a spirituality bookstore on the near north side of Chicago. And what I found myself doing, I went there with a couple other people. They went and looked at history or doctrine. I looked for spirituality, meditation. And back then, that long ago, there wasn't much translated into English. There are a lot of great books now, but they weren't available back in 1968, written by Europeans in their languages. But there wasn't much written in the United States that I could get hold of, that I knew about. I mean, maybe Alan Watts was around, but I didn't know Alan Watts. If I picked up a book, this is a book by Alan Watts, I said, okay, so who's he? But I did see, I would look for books, and on the spine, it would say silence, solitude, stillness, and those are the books that attracted me. Those are the books that I wanted. And I found out, so this can be a key, again, to whether or not you're called to be a contemplative, is what kind of reading excites you? I mean, I don't mean you like reading mystery novels. I mean, I grew up reading the Hardy Boys, and the girls read Drew stuff. And this is something that grabs you, and you want to read it, and everybody around you thinks it's boring. That tells you, because there's not going to be many contemplatives in this world, but that tells you that that's you. Pursue that excitement. Pursue that interest, that sort of drawing you to a center. And but I didn't have the guts to do much about it. All I did was move to San Francisco because it was better weather. But what I did out there was, again, I found myself going to the nearby church and sitting there. The Catholic churches were open pretty much all day then, and you could just go and be quiet in the church. And sometimes I would go to a daily mass. I never went on weekends. I was either partying or I was going out and seeing the countryside, camping and stuff like that. Never went on weekends, but sometimes I'd like to go to, the Catholics have daily mass, and it's quick and quiet. Two things I liked, unlike this talk. So I like to be there just for that little 25 minutes. And the priests gave short homilies. I didn't grow up with short homilies, but they were called Paulist fathers. And that's what introduced me to them. I said, they give short homilies that make sense and speak to my life. I wonder what these guys are all about. Because while I was in California, I left the company I was at, and I went to live in the mountains, Tahoe for the winter. And I did a lot of reading there, and I decided that, and I had time to be by myself. And I didn't mind that. I was by myself most of the week. Other people came up on weekends to ski. So I was not bored. I was not bored with myself. So I was not having a lot of loneliness experiences. I mean, I could walk into a bar and feel lonely, but I could just be by myself in Lake Tahoe in the house that we had, and I was fine. But I decided that I was going to, am I going to be a Christian? Do I really believe all this stuff? I got time. So I took out the Bible, and I knew from all my religious training there were 4 Gospels. The first one happened to be Matthew. And I said, I'm just going to read these Gospels, and if something doesn't make sense, I'll pass on and read the next thing. And I got to chapter 11, verse 28 to 32. Come to me, O you who are weary and find life burdensome. Boom. That was the enlightened moment for me, when I began to transition from all those little experiences I told you about to the realization that God was always within me and loved me unconditionally. Because at that point, my life was weary and burdensome. I was really going nowhere and still asking the question, what the heck is the purpose of my life? And it was only in reading certain books that I found other people asking those questions. The people I hung around with never asked those questions. Either they were happy or they couldn't care less. There was nothing profound that grabbed me. And this did. And so it said to me, I don't have to be good to get God. I always have God. And God loves me just as I am. That's what chapter 11, 28 to 32. Just as I am. I was sort of taught that you have to become good to get God. Now, be whatever you are. Be the mess that you think you are. And from here, we're going to do some work. And the transformation will take place from wherever you are, however you are. Relatively unemployed. I think I was waiting tables or something like that in Tahoe. So that said to me, that's good news. I'd like to tell somebody about that. Well, who does that in my tradition is a priest. Well, I wasn't quite ready, so I went back into business and did some stockbrokering. And then finally I said to myself, you're spending all this time thinking about this. You go into churches and sitting quietly. You're not going to Mass, but you're going to sit quietly and thinking about just being present to this, just sitting. So I joined the Paulist Fathers. And what I found I liked most was, even in the seminary, was this same being quiet and still. And then another experience was I was in my first assignment in Houston, Texas. And on the shelf was a book by an Episcopal priest named Morton Kelsey. And it was called The Other Side of Silence. I'd read that book. And Morton Kelsey, he had it. And even went to a retreat that he gave someplace in New Mexico, I think. I don't know. In any case, Morton Kelsey, I picked that book. And then I started reading all the books that had to do with mysticism and learning about it and beginning to do this kind of prayer. And what I discovered is that the prayer, for me, now that I'm in the monastery, I've actually lived there for the last 2 years, full time. What I found out in the monastery is that this presence is always with me and is just waiting for me to stop paying attention to myself, to my thoughts, to my imagination, and stop trying to be anybody. Don't try to be important. Don't try to be anything. And because you're seemingly going to accomplish nothing sitting there quietly in a monastery. But you know that it's the place for you if it's fulfilling. Not every time. Because what I find happens in the contemplative practice, and I think if you sit 30 to 40 minutes, you can build it up like an athlete can build up their endurance or whatever. 30 to 40 minutes makes a real difference. And what you find when I don't pay attention to my thoughts, and that to me is all that methods are for. They're not to get God. They're not to have wonderful thoughts. You've got all kinds of prayers and rituals for that. It is to stop paying attention to my mind, which takes in all kinds of thoughts, like a cheap hotel takes in all kinds of people. It just takes in everything and chews on it. And so I don't pay attention to it. But it isn't as if I have these suddenly have these great moments. What happens a lot of times is now what God is going to do, this presence, this power, this energy, this force, that is everywhere and nowhere, is within me. It's going to show me myself in all my faults and failings that get in the way of becoming what I guess a lot of people call non-dualistic, one with the world, or a no-wall spirituality. There's nothing that divides you from anything. You just experience a sense of oneness. You don't go right there. You have to go through the mess of your life. And so a lot of times what you're doing to get to that depth, and I don't know if that many people write about it, but to get to that depth, you have to go through you could call it a darkness. I call it just faults and failings, shortcomings, character defects, bad habits that you probably know something about, but you don't know the depth of them and how strong and powerful they are. And so you begin to see this, and you realize, I'm not going to get rid of this all by myself. Knowledge avails you nothing, in one sense. Bill W. said that to alcoholics. Knowledge avails you nothing. It doesn't change you. But it does show you that you need to completely surrender to this energy, this presence. And the presence and the power of the presence will gradually weaken all those faults and failings. But they may never go away. But what happens is they no longer control your responses to the world. So you get up in the morning and you're able to enter into the world as it is and have a certain response to it that becomes different. A certain compassion, forgiveness, a sense of oneness with the people around you. Whereas before they used to drive you crazy and you wanted them dead. And now you find they haven't changed one iota. The world doesn't change because you are a contemplative, but you change. And then the world right around you will begin to change a little because they will pick up on your something about you. Or maybe it won't. Maybe they're just pathologically a mess, who knows. But you're not about changing other people. You're about becoming who you are made to be. And so when people ask you questions like, why are you in a monastery? Or what right do they have to know? Think of Matthew. When Jesus said, come. Matthew didn't say, okay, guys, now here's why I'm going. Now, I'm going to follow this guy. And here's the 3 reasons I'm going to do it, and so on and so forth. He didn't explain anything to anybody. He just got up and went. And he didn't go because he knew he was going to get something. He just responded to the call. And I think that's the way the contemplative is. You don't have to explain yourself to other people because they won't get it. They just won't get it. It was a lot easier for me to work for the big corporate places I worked and tell people why I was there, even if I didn't believe it myself. But I can give them reasons that were acceptable. They can plug into that. In our neoliberal capitalism, getting things and so on and so forth. The individual over again, separate from, and so on and so forth. Buying this, having that. They understand all that stuff. But you start talking about trying to be no one, and not trying to go anywhere, just trying to be here now. And they look at you like, oh, what a lost soul. Sorry to hear that. Which is, I'm sure, what, you can look back at some of the spiritual, evolved people that you might have read about and heard about, and they had just as many troubles with people around them as anybody else has. So it's not a popularity contest, but it is a response. It's always a response to something that you can't quite put in a box, but it's urging you and pulling you. You maybe meet somebody along the way. I did. I moved to Boulder. My second assignment out of Houston was Boulder, Colorado. I'd never been there. I'd never been to Boulder. And it's the smorgasbord of spirituality. If it's going on in Boulder. And many of the people there have tried several of them because what they're trying to do is feel better. So you'd see, I meet all kinds. I used to practice Zen. I used to get into the Tao. I used to be a Christian. Let's see, what else? Various kinds of things. They all used to be's. Now you meet people that used to be in centering prayer because they didn't get something that they wanted. And that's not what this relationship is about, getting something that you want, because you don't know what you want. You just know what you got isn't it. So you have to stay with it through the boring times, because I think this presence wants to know, when I said this presence is with me always, it wants unconditionally. What it wants to know is how unconditional is my presence, my love. And if it's conditional, it's because I want to get something out of it. So there are many times in the monastery when I sit for my meditation or whatever, I'm bored to death. My mind is wandering, and I'm wandering around with it. And or the half hour or whatever, it just is an eternity. But you show up on a regular basis because that's your commitment. You don't show up because you feel good or because you want to get something or whatever. You show up because that's what you've decided. That's your commitment. And little by little, things will happen. I got to meet Thomas Keating, since passed, who was a monk at Trappist Monastery, was one of the reasons I started coming there. And I'll end with this. I went to a Buddhist-Christian dialogue, which Boulder used to have. And it was made up of people who have a contemplative background. That is in their tradition. Lots of Catholics and Jews. And I was there. The second year I went there, there was the whole list of talks, sort of like the think tanks you have up here in Aspen, week of ideas. You said, which one should I go to? Well, there was one in which there was a Trappist monk. Now, I didn't know much about Trappists, but I knew they were the hardcore monks of some sort. And a Roshi who was Asian, which I liked. I went to a Hindu ashram, and the Swami was an Italian from Brooklyn. I mean, give me a break. I mean, he knew stuff, yeah, and that's fine. I wanted to meet the real thing, to me at that time. So I said, where's the guy from? Well, he was from, I don't know, Asia someplace. And he had on the long robe. So, to me, that's the guy. So I'm sitting way in the back, I think. But I could still see pretty good then. And out walks this fellow, Thomas Keating. Within 5 minutes, I said, that's the man for me. Why? Because he had become what he was supposed to be. He was living what he was talking about. And you just know it when you see it. And everybody else is impersonating the Buddha. So That's it. I continue to pursue this life because I don't do much public ministry anymore. I do a lot of teaching on Zoom, but you don't have to go anywhere. But I just pursue this relationship now because I feel called and invited. And if I don't, then I think I will not be me. And I think it's a very hard life to be somebody you're not. Thank you.